So, in the Economic Survey 2022 tabled in the Parliament today, FY22 GDP growth is seen at 9.2%. And for the next year, they have forecasted between 8 to 8.5%. How do you see these projections and how far do you feel the economy is poised to meet these targets?
Let me take them in two parts. Let me take that 9.2%. People outside the government have also remarked on the fact that there is a revival going on. It's a fairly robust revival across sectors, and this does not merely offset the decline that happened in the preceding year. The level of GDP also surpasses the pre-pandemic levels. This is a point that survey has also made. If you look at external forecasts, most people today would go along with that 9.2% real growth rate projected in survey for this financial year. So therefore, I think that 9.2% is completely realistic. Whether it's going to be 9% or 9.5%, we will know only at the end of the year, but 9.2% is completely realistic. The second part of the question was about next financial year, 2022-2023. One must remember that there are certain sectors, contact-intensive sectors, service sectors, which have not yet completely recovered. They are in the process of recovering, and therefore there is a low base, and growth rates are always a function of the low base. Therefore, I would go along with that 8 to 8.5% despite the uncertainty, although I would say that it is perfectly possible that it might actually be a little bit higher.
And so, talking of services sector, despite the fact that COVID had its maximum impact on the services sector, it has contributed over 50% to India's GDP according to the economic survey, and 8.2% annual growth rate has been forecast. So you feel that this is a very strong indication of sustained recovery in the economy?
Yes, but one should not look only at the share, because remember, services are a very, very heterogeneous basket. There are all kinds of services. And so far as service sector growth is concerned, it is not per se the pandemic, it is the restrictions on economic activity that followed the pandemic. Some service sectors, travel-related, trade, hotels, restaurants, tourism, some of those are still affected by restrictions. Anything that has human-to-human contact is still affected. And that's the reason I said that in next year, these will recover, and I find 8 to 8.5% perfectly realistic. What is important is already one can see revival of construction. And therefore, yes, I do think the services sector will grow pretty fast.
And so the industry sector, the gross value added or the growth rate is 11.8% projection, and agriculture is 3.9%. What is your estimation of the major budget announcements which will support this growth?
What is implicitly said in the survey, implicitly, not explicitly, is that what one will expect in the budget is a continuation of the policies. Survey says it implicitly, not explicitly, that the reason India has recovered fairly fast and fairly well from the effects of the pandemic is because of these successful policies. So I do not think, one should not look at only the union budget, because the budget is only one day in the year and government does not cease to function on other days of the year, although the budget is important because it is a major event where government announces what its thinking is. So what I expect in the budget is a continuation of the government's policies since actually May 2014, because in some sense this government is a continuation of the past government. And that is essentially what survey also says, that have an enabling framework for growth, have an enabling framework for consumption, investments, private investments, exports, do not throw fiscal consolidation to the winds, and simultaneously have a social safety net.
Sir, retail inflation remains moderate during current year. It has been projected at 5.2% in 2021-22. In fact, that is the figure for April to December. But at the same time, Economic Survey has cautioned about imported inflation. So how do you see the inflation situation being tackled on the fiscal level and the monetary level?
But inflation is still within the band set by the Reserve Bank's MPC. So I would not be unnecessarily concerned about inflation. The nature of this inflation, and survey also points it out, is sometimes dislocations that have happened for various reasons. And this kind of inflation is not always amenable to monetary policy instruments. There are certain kinds of inflation that are amenable to monetary policy instruments, but this kind of inflation is not amenable to that. So far as imported inflation is concerned, yes, commodity prices have been going up. Imported inflation is also a function of what happens to the exchange rate. So if the rupee tends to depreciate, imported inflation tends to be more. I should, however, also say that the Indian economy is no longer as amenable to crude price increase shocks as it used to be in the past.
And so the startup ecosystem, if we look at that, the boom that has come there from 500 in 2014, now we have more than 60,000 startups. And the thrust that the government is giving to the micro, small and medium enterprises, you feel this will be also another key to economic recovery and this thrust will be continued?
Yes, absolutely, because in the course of the pandemic, at a very broad-based level of generalization, the MSME sector has suffered a lot. And I think the MSME sector will begin to recover in the coming financial year. Although one must also be a little bit careful about what we mean by MSME, because a large number of MSME enterprises are not registered under any legal form. And therefore, perforce they resort to informal credit markets. One of the things that's going to be on the agenda, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but at some point we must evolve a form of legal identity for MSME enterprises, most of whom are not registered under any law.
And sir, Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, production-linked incentive scheme to boost manufacturing in specific sectors, all this has happened in the pandemic times. Do you feel this targeted reforms approach of the government in productive sectors has turned the COVID crisis into an opportunity?
Yes, it has, in terms of ensuring that manufacturing, you used the word industry earlier, manufacturing is narrower than industry. Manufacturing in some sectors already, one can see that India is becoming a part of the global supply chain, and investments that might have happened in other countries have now begun to come to India. So therefore, I would say that this is a very, very good sign, because the multiplier benefits from any investments that happen in India are much higher compared to plain and simple imports happening from other countries.
And so lastly, the strategy of the government so far has largely been teach people fishing instead of giving them fish. We saw that though the government did give a direct benefit support through Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana and other schemes for the marginalized and vulnerable, the major thrust so far has been on enabling the spirit of entrepreneurship, where people become job creators instead of job seekers. How far has this approach of empowering and enabling yielded productive results?
I agree with what you have said, and the PM has said it himself in more than one speech. But I would not quite state it in either or terms, because the government's position has been fairly clear that yes, you move away from entitlement, begin to empower people, provide them with the physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, other kinds of inputs that are essential to enhance their productivity, unleash entrepreneurship, reduce poverty, generate employment. But simultaneously, there will be targeted beneficiaries who will need some kind of subsidization. So that's also simultaneously been happening. While what you have said is absolutely correct, I would not exactly posit it as an either or, because both have to happen simultaneously.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Thank you.